Good afternoon, Eric. Would you like to do your mic check now?
Crystal, can you hear me?
I can, nice and clear. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the Fair Housing Act Requirement 1, Accessible Building Entrance on an Accessible Route. This training is approximately an hour and a half in length. The GoToWebinar platform viewing screen. Under the GoToWebinar platform, you will find several dashboard items. This includes the viewing screen. We seem to have a bit of a technical issue with the interpreter screen. Let's see if we can work that out before we proceed.
He's coming across on my screen, Crystal.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Okay, so you will see at the top, it will state whose screen you are viewing and will allow you to zoom in and or screenshot the items you see on the screen. The webcam function should be disabled. The GoToWebinar dashboard and control panel. You can set up the dashboard to include the screen that is being shared and the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can move it to another window if you have multiple screens. The GoToWebinar control panel. The GoToWebinar control panel is where you will control your audio, review any attached handouts, and ask any questions. Today, we have 3 handouts in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar control panel. These handouts include the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, and the Participant Workbook. GoToWebinar knowledge checks. During the webinar, we will be conducting knowledge checks. The GoToWebinar platform calls these quick polls. When we launch the polls, they will automatically appear. To select your answer, click the circle next to the answer and hit submit at the bottom. GoToWebinar certificate. For attending at least 45 minutes of today's presentation, you will receive an attendance certificate. If you attend for less than 45 minutes, you will not receive an attendance certificate. The attendance certificate will be sent to you on Wednesday. If you take the final quiz, which will be available at the end of today's presentation, and pass the quiz, you will receive a passing certificate. The final quiz was in the reminder emails and will be in an email that comes to participants 2 hours after the webinar. You may take the quiz at any time following this training, and passing certificates will immediately be issued for a score of 80% or higher. Agenda, topics, and learning objectives. Today's agenda includes an introduction, topics, and learning objectives to help you understand Fair Housing Act Requirement 1, Accessible Building Entrance on an Accessible Route. During this session, we will cover the following topics and learning objectives. Our terminal learning objective, or TLO, is to identify the design and construction guidance provided for FHA Requirement 1. Our topics and enabling learning objectives, or ELOs, are as follows. Topic 1, Fair Housing Act Overview. ELO, identify the history and protections of the Fair Housing Act. Topic 2, Requirement 1, accessible building entrance on an accessible route. ELO, identify the design guidance provided in Requirement 1. Topic 3, elements of an accessible route. ELO, identify the elements and structures that comprise an accessible route. Topic 4, accessible building entrances. ELO, identify the specifications for accessible doors and entrance areas on accessible routes. We'll follow that with a live Q&A session. And then we will have our knowledge check review. We will close out the training session and you will be able to take your final quiz. This training relies on the provisions of the Fair Housing Act and its regulations, the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines, the American National Standards Institute, also known as ANSI, A-N-S-I, A117.1, 1986 version, and the FHA Design Manual for the guidance it provides about compliance with the technical design and construction requirements in the Act. Presenters. Today's presenters include Mr. Eric Contreras, Mr. Michael Dyson, and I am Crystal Nolan. Mr. Contreras has 20 years of experience performing accessibility consulting services, Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA compliance evaluations, implementation plan development, ADA corporate policy guidance and interpretation, and ADA compliance reviews. During the live Q&A session, Mr. Contreras will answer your questions, which you can type in the questions pod. Mr. Dyson has several years of experience facilitating webinars, workshops, and live events, and looks forward to supporting this training. I am Crystal Nolan, and I have worked in education, media, and advocacy for over 20 years, and I am also pleased to assist with today's training. Today's technical support will be provided by Ms. Corey Nolan and Ms. Alexia Brown. Ms. Liz Dyson will organize your questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation, which Mr. Contreras will answer. The Fair Housing Accessibility First program provides a design and construction resource center, also known as the DCRC, which is staffed Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern. The DCRC provides comprehensive and detailed instructions, helpful online web resources, and an information line for technical guidance and support. You can reach the DCRC toll-free at 888-341-7781. Or you can reach the DCRC at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. And now we'll move into topic 1, Fair Housing Act overview. FHA history. Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was enacted by Congress and outlawed public and private housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Congress amended the coverage of the FHA in 1988 to also prohibit housing discrimination practices based on disability and familial status. Buyers and renters who are disabled are protected, as well as households that include a person with a disability and people who are not disabled but are associated with people who are disabled. You can scan the QR code on the screen or visit HUD's website for more information about the protections and the types of dwellings covered by the FHA. Now we'll move on to talk about FHA safe harbors. A safe harbor is a recognized objective standard guideline or code that, if followed without deviation, ensures compliance with the Act's design and construction requirements. FHA protections help to ensure that the built environment of covered multifamily dwelling sites are inclusive, accessible, and visitable for people with disabilities. However, the FHA does not establish a single accessibility standard. To comply with the FHA, designers and builders must select a safe harbor standard to guide the construction of multifamily dwellings. There are 15 standards that HUD has identified as safe harbors. These HUD-approved safe harbors have been reviewed by HUD and meet or exceed the building construction requirements in the FHA. If you would like to have a list of the 15 standards that HUD has approved, please scan the QR code on the screen or visit HUD's Frequently Asked Questions page. 7 requirements. The purpose of the FHA is realized by the 7 requirements of the guidelines, which establish minimal levels of accessibility. The 7 requirements apply to covered multifamily dwellings designed and constructed to be occupied for the first time after March 13, 1991. The guidelines provide detailed technical design and construction specifications and explain the areas of multifamily developments with accessibility obligations. The 7 basic requirements are: 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. Requirement 3, usable doors. Requirement 4, accessible routes into and through the covered unit. Requirement 5, light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls in accessible locations. Requirement 6, reinforced walls in bathrooms for later installation of grab bars. And requirement 7, usable kitchens and bathrooms. And this brings us to our first knowledge check. The knowledge check reads: a blank is a standard, guideline, or code that ensures compliance with the FHA if followed without deviation. And the first answer selection is a security haven. The second answer selection is a spring harbor. And the third answer selection is safe harbor. And I'll launch that knowledge check now so that you can select your answer and submit it. And again, that question reads: a blank is a standard, guideline, or code that ensures compliance with the FHA if followed without deviation. Selection A is security haven, selection B is spring harbor, and selection C is safe harbor. And we'll give a few more seconds so that everyone can get their answers in. And I'll close the poll now. And now we'll move to knowledge check 2. And knowledge check 2 reads: the 7 requirements apply to covered multifamily dwellings occupied for the first time after March 13, 1991. And the first answer selection is true, and the second answer selection is false. And I'll launch this poll rather, so that you can submit your answers. Again, knowledge check 2 reads: the 7 requirements apply to covered multifamily dwellings occupied for the first time after March 13, 1991. Selection A is true, selection B is false. We'll give a few more seconds for the selections. And now we'll close that poll and we'll move on to key takeaways. Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was enacted by Congress and outlawed public and private housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Congress amended the coverage of the FHA in 1988 to also prohibit housing discrimination practices based on disability and familial status. A safe harbor is an objective and recognized standard, guideline, or code that, if followed without deviation, ensures compliance with the FHA. There are 15 standards that HUD has identified as safe harbors. The 7 requirements apply to covered multifamily dwellings to be occupied for the first time after March 13, 1991. And that brings us to topic 2. Requirement 1, accessible building entrance on an accessible route. Now, requirement 1 specifies that each covered building on a site must have at least one accessible entrance on an accessible route. The guidelines do not determine the total number of entrances a building must have, nor where they must be positioned. It is expected that most sites can and should be made accessible with an accessible route provided to entrances of covered dwellings. Therefore, it is also expected that covered dwelling units will be provided on all building sites, including those where steep slopes, rock outcroppings, marshy areas, and similar conditions exist. Designing an accessible route. Accessible routes and accessible entrances may occur in the course of any design project. They also may not occur and be expensive to include later if a careful approach to site design is not conducted. Deliberate manipulation of the grade to avoid the requirements of the FHA is regarded as a discriminatory housing practice and must be avoided. Requirement 1 provides tests to assist a developer of buildings that do not have one or more elevators to determine when an accessible entrance is impractical because of extreme terrain or unusual characteristics of the site. Units where entrances are impractical do not have to meet the other design requirements. The test, therefore, can alter the number of units on a site that must comply. Early planning for accessible routes. Planning for accessibility should be an integral part of the design process in multifamily housing development. This is particularly crucial in the early stages of planning, when major designs are being made about the site's overall design. The location and orientation of buildings, parking areas, loading zones, and other elements have a major impact on the ease with which accessibility can be achieved in a finished development. This is especially important on sloping sites where careful initial planning can eliminate the need for major earthwork and the construction of elaborate ramps, bridges, lifts, or elevators to provide accessibility. Planning for entrance floor levels. Attempts should be made to set the entrance floor levels of buildings at or close to ground levels to eliminate or minimize changes in level that may require steps or ramps. Often, this may be accomplished using field dirt excavated from other parts of the building site, to alter the ground levels at appropriate places. Since people generally arrive at buildings by private car, bus, or taxi, the location of vehicle arrival points is critical. Passenger drop-off points and parking areas for people with disabilities should be located close to building entrances and at levels that do not necessitate climbing steep slopes to reach the entrance floor level. The path of travel to and placement of site amenities, such as outside mailboxes, refuse disposal areas, swimming pools, clubhouses, and sports facilities, should be considered early in the planning process. Site and practicality test. Requirement 1 of the guidelines includes 2 site and practicality tests that can be used to determine if an accessible route at a required entrance is impractical due to extreme terrain or site conditions. Site impracticality is not allowed for buildings with 1 or more elevators and those served by a planned elevated walkway. The individual building test is a 2-step process that analyzes the grade difference between the undisturbed site and planned site building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. The site analysis test is a 3-step test that evaluates the topography of a site and determines the buildable area and the number of accessible units required. The test and their applications are described in detail on pages 1.38 to 1.58 of the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. Site impracticality due to unusual site characteristics. It may be impractical to provide an accessible route on certain sites where a law or regulation requires the lowest finished floor or other structural member to be raised to a specific level above the base floor evaluation. Examples of such sites are those located in federally designated floodplains or coastal high hazard areas where buildings must be raised to a specific level above the base flood elevation. On a site with unusual characteristics, it is impractical to provide an accessible route to a building entrance only if both of the following conditions occur. The first condition is there is a 30-inch difference in finished grade elevation measured between the lowest permissible planned entrance and all pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet. If there are no pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet of the planned entrance, the measurement must be made between the lowest allowed planned entrance and the closest pedestrian arrival point. And the second condition is the slope between the lowest permissible planned entrance and all pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet exceeds 10%. Likewise, if there are no pedestrian arrival points within 50 feet of the planned entrance, the measurement must be made between the lowest allowed planned entrance and the closest pedestrian arrival point. And that brings us to our third knowledge check. And that knowledge check reads, buildings with one or more elevators can claim site impracticality. And the first answer option is always. The second answer option is never. The third answer option is sometimes. And I'll launch that poll so that you can input your answers. Again, knowledge check 3. Buildings with one or more elevators can claim site impracticality. The first answer option is always. The second answer option is never. And the third answer option is sometimes. Give you a few more seconds to submit your answers. And we'll close this poll and we'll move to the next. Knowledge check 4 reads, the blank analyzes grade differences of an undisturbed site and planned building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. The first option is individual building test. The second option is site analysis test. And the third option is FHA test. And now I'll launch this poll and you can submit your answers. Again, the blank analyzes grade differences of an undisturbed site and planned building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. First option, individual building test. Second option, site analysis test. And the third option is FHA test. Give you a few more seconds to submit your answers. And I'm going to close that poll now. And we'll move to knowledge check 5. Knowledge check 5 reads, the blank evaluates the topography of a site and determines the buildable area and the number of accessible units required. The first answer option is FHA test. The second answer option is individual building test. And the third answer option is site analysis test. And we'll launch this poll so that you can submit your answers. Oh, I think we had a technical difficulty with that question. It was closed too soon. My apologies for that error. Okay, so we're going to move along now to topic 2, key takeaways. Requirement 1 specifies that each covered building on a site must have at least one accessible entrance on an accessible route. The second key takeaway is passenger drop-off points, and parking areas for people with disabilities should be located close to building entrances and at levels that do not necessitate climbing steep slopes to reach the entrance floor level. Site impracticality is not allowed for buildings having one or more elevators. The individual building test analyzes the grade difference between the undisturbed site and planned site building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. And last but not least, the site analysis test evaluates the topography of a site and determines the buildable area and the number of accessible units required. And we will move ahead now to topic 3, elements of an accessible route. General specifications of an accessible route. Specifications for accessible routes are found in ANSI 4.3. The general specifications concerning certain elements of accessible routes which must be given careful attention are the width of the route, the running slope, the cross slope, ground and floor surfaces, headroom, protruding objects, curb ramps, and platform lifts and elevator designs. Width and slopes. The general specifications for width and slope include a 36-inch minimum width. ANSI gives additional specifications to apply when accessible routes go around obstructions. The maximum running slope of an accessible route is 1 to 20. Slopes greater than 1 to 20 up to 1 to 12 are allowed, but they must comply with the ramp provisions in ANSI. Cross slopes may not exceed 1 to 50, which is approximately a 1/4 inch per foot or 1 to 48. Ground and floor surfaces. ANSI 4.3 accessible route also provides specifications for ground and floor surfaces that accessible routes must comply with. Ground surfaces along accessible routes must be stable, firm, and slip resistant. Gravel or loose stone, as shown in this photograph, is not allowed. Surfaces such as these are hazardous for people who use mobility aids such as canes, crutches, walkers, wheelchairs, and scooters. And now that brings us to our next knowledge check. Knowledge check 6 reads, an accessible route must have a minimum width of blank inches. The first selection is 24. The second selection is 36. The third selection is 48. And the fourth selection is 32. And so now we will launch this poll so that you may submit your answers. Again, the question reads, an accessible route must have a minimum width of blank inches. 24 is your first option, 36 is your second option, 48 is your third option, and 32 is your fourth option. Please make your selections. Give a few more seconds before we close this poll. Okay. And now we will talk about protruding objects. ANSI 4.4 provides specifications for protruding objects. Example of protruding or wall-hung objects that must not protrude more than 4 inches when located between 27 inches and 80 inches above the finished floor include fire extinguisher cabinets, mailboxes, large ornate picture frames, light fixtures, wall-mounted water fountains, and wall-mounted telephones. Objects mounted lower than 27 inches above the finished floor may protrude any amount as long as the minimum clear width of 36 inches is maintained. Headroom. Accessible routes along walks, corridors, breezeways, and other circulation spaces must have an 80-inch minimum headroom height, including wall and ceiling mounted signs, light fixtures, etc. Frequently, in multifamily buildings, open stairways leading to upper floors are located in breezeways. When provided, the underside of the stairs must be protected from cross traffic by a guardrail or other barrier with its leading edge at or below 27 inches above the finished floor. Curb ramps. ANSI provides specification for 3 curb ramp designs. In all 3 designs, the maximum running slope is 1 to 12. The slopes of side flares vary. Flared side curb ramps may be recessed into pedestrian walkways. If there is a 48-inch level passageway or greater at the top of the ramp, side flares may be 1 to 10. Otherwise, they must slope no greater than 1 to 12. If an accessible route passes by the top of a flared ramp, a minimum width of 36 inches must be maintained. As noted above, side flares would need slopes no steeper than 1 to 12. The built-up ramp design extends into the parking area, but must not extend into a traffic lane. Side flares may not exceed the 1 to 10 slope. Built-up ramps are not preferred as they sometimes interfere with the operation of wheelchair lifts. Excuse me. Returned curb ramps may be used where pedestrian traffic is not intended to cross the ramp. Now moving on, we're going to talk about platform lifts and elevator designs. Elevators, ramps, and mechanical lifts can be part of an accessible route. As ANSI 117.1, the 1986 version specified, platform lifts can be used instead of an elevator or a ramp under certain conditions. If platform lifts are used, they shall facilitate unassisted entry, operation, and exit from the lift. No abrupt changes in level. An accessible route must connect covered dwelling units with accessible site facilities and should have no abrupt level changes. ANSI 4.3.8 allows an accessible route to include changes in level up to 1/4 inch that may be vertical and without edge treatment. Changes in level up to between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch that may be beveled with a slope not exceeding 1 to 2. In the example on the screen, you see a route with no abrupt changes in level that provides access to dwelling units and site amenities. Notice the accessible ramp to the covered dwelling units, mailboxes, and accessible play area. Using the ramp, a wheelchair user can reach the accessible bus stop shelter or a wheelchair parking space and a curb ramp that allows wheelchair users to cross the street. Stairs and accessible routes. Stairs are not an acceptable component of an accessible route because they prevent use by people using wheelchairs and others who cannot climb steps. However, ANSI specifications for accessible stairs make stairs safer and more usable for mobility impaired people who can climb stairs. When stairs are installed along routes that are required to be accessible, there must be an alternate way to get between levels. If the alternative way is an elevator or lift, the stairs do not need to comply with ANSI 4.9. If the alternative way is a ramp, the stairs must comply with ANSI 4.9. When an accessible route consists of both a ramp and stairs, it is best that they are located in close proximity. So people who can use only one of the two, such as the ramp, need not travel an unreasonable additional distance. Walks on accessible routes. Walks that are part of an accessible route become ramps when their slope exceeds 5% or 1 in 20. Handrails are not required on walks with slopes between 0% and 5%, but are required on those steeper than 5% and up to 8.33%, which is 1 in 12. Slopes steeper than 8.33% are not usable by most people with disabilities and cannot be considered part of an accessible route. Handrail requirements for walks differ depending upon which buildings the walks connect. And that brings us to knowledge check 7. And the knowledge check reads, when designing and constructing walkways, a slope steeper than 8.33% blank be part of an accessible route. The first answer option is can, and the second answer option is cannot. And now I will launch this poll so that you can submit your answers. And again, the knowledge check reads, when designing and constructing walkways, a slope steeper than 8.33% blank be a part of an accessible route. Option A is can, and option B is cannot. And we'll give a few more seconds so that everyone can submit their answers. And now we will close this poll and we'll continue. Accessible route from site arrival points to accessible building entrances. The guidelines require that an accessible route be provided from public transportation stops, accessible parking spaces, accessible passenger loading zones, and public streets or sidewalks to accessible building entrances. Because these walkways are required to be accessible, handrails, as per ANSI, ANSI, must be provided when the running slope of the walk is between 5%, which is 1 in 20, and 8.33%, which is 1 in 12. And it has a rise over 6 inches. Accessible routes and walks between accessible buildings and site facilities. The guidelines require accessible routes to connect buildings containing covered dwelling units and accessible facilities, elements, and spaces on the same site. The guidelines do not require accessible routes, walks, or paths between buildings containing only covered dwelling units unless the route is also part of a required accessible route. For example, if a building also contains a facility such as laundry shared by 2 buildings, then an accessible route must be provided between the 2 buildings. If no portion of the finished grade of a route between 2 buildings that contain only dwelling units exceeds 8.33% or 1 in 12, it is recommended that the route be made accessible. Such voluntary accessible walk must meet the same specifications as an accessible route, except that handrails commonly required on accessible routes when their slope exceeds 5% or 1 in 20 are not required. Now let's talk about the use of vehicles for access to site facilities. The guidelines allow automobiles to be used for access if certain conditions are met. The finished grade exceeds 1 to 12. If other physical barriers exist, natural or man-made, and if there are legal restrictions. All the circumstances listed are outside the control of the owner. If any of these conditions prevent the installation of an accessible pedestrian route, between covered dwellings and some public or common use site facilities, vehicular access may be permitted. For most sites, providing all required accessible pedestrian routes will likely be considered achievable. However, when such a vehicular route is used as an alternative method to achieve accessibility, the required parking at covered dwelling units must be provided, and an appropriate number of additional accessible parking spaces on an accessible route must be provided at each facility that is otherwise unreachable using an accessible pedestrian route. Careful planning and strategically locating accessible parking spaces and curb ramps around dwelling units and amenities will help give continuity between vehicular and pedestrian accessible routes. And now we have come to our knowledge check 8, and the knowledge check reads: the guidelines allow the use of vehicles for access to site amenities under certain conditions. Your first answer option is true, and your second answer option is false. And I'm going to launch this poll now so that you can submit your answers. And again, the knowledge check reads: the guidelines allow the use of vehicles for access to site amenities under certain conditions. Option A is true, option B is false. And we'll give a few more seconds so that everyone can get their answers in. And we'll close this poll and we'll move to the key takeaways. General specifications for elements of an accessible route include cross and running slopes, route surfaces, headroom, protruding objects, curb ramps, platform lifts, and elevator designs. An accessible route must have a minimum width of 36 inches. Slopes steeper than 8.33% are not usable by most people with disabilities and cannot be considered part of an accessible route. The guidelines require that an accessible route be provided from public transportation stops, accessible parking spaces, accessible passenger loading zones, and public streets or sidewalks to accessible building entrances. And the guidelines allow the use of vehicles for access to site amenities if certain conditions are met. So now we find ourselves at topic 4, accessible building entrances. Accessible entrance design features. An entrance door must be usable by people with disabilities. Detailed specifications to achieve this are given in ANSI 4.13. Accessible doors are considered public and common use spaces and must meet ANSI requirements on both sides of the door, unlike with dwelling unit entrances. Some of the main features that must be addressed at accessible doors are a minimum width of 32 inches, low or no threshold, clear maneuvering space inside and outside of the door, low force needed to open the door, accessible door hardware, and a safe door closing speed. Entrances to buildings without elevators. Buildings not having elevators must have at least one accessible entrance on an accessible route unless prohibited by extreme terrain or unusual site characteristics. Only ground floor dwelling units are covered in buildings without elevators, and each dwelling unit must be on an accessible route. Note, in buildings either with or without elevators, more than one accessible entrance may be required when there is more than one ground floor, there is a split level ground floor, or when units are clustered on the ground floor and each cluster has a separate entrance. And that brings us to knowledge check 9. Knowledge check 9 reads, an accessible entrance door must have a minimum width of blank inches. Your first answer choice is 28. Your second answer choice is 32. The third answer choice is 30. And the fourth answer choice is 31 5/8 nominal. And I'm going to launch this poll so that you can select your correct answer and submit it. Again, knowledge check 9 reads, an accessible entrance door must have a minimum width of blank inches. And the first choice is 28. The second choice is 32. The third choice is 30. And the fourth choice is 31 5/8 nominal. And we'll give a few more seconds. And now we will close that poll and we will continue ahead. Ground floor. In some circumstances, the ground floor may not be at grade level. For example, when common use spaces such as parking, meeting rooms, and shops occupy the floor at grade level, the first floor containing dwelling units above or below that level will be the designated ground floor for the purposes of the guidelines. Buildings having one or more elevators. It is important to note that some buildings may contain an elevator and not be considered a building having one or more elevators. For example, when an elevator travels from a garage or other entry level not containing dwelling units only to a ground floor containing dwelling units, these ground floor units are covered. However, the building is not a building having one or more elevators, and the elevator is not required to travel to all floors. Buildings having connected elevator and non-elevator wings. Buildings with multiple wings and different configurations may have to provide more than one entrance and possibly more than one elevator. If any wing has an elevator, all of the units in that building are covered and must be on an accessible route. Buildings with separate exterior ground floor unit entrances. Where a building has ground floor units, each with its own exterior entrance, the guidelines provide that each of these ground floor units shall have an accessible entrance, be on an accessible route, and meet all other design requirements of the guidelines. The only exception applies to ground floor units where terrain or unusual characteristics of the site make an accessible entrance on an accessible route impractical. Buildings with separate ground floor unit entrances on 2 or more ground floors. Where a building has ground floor units with their own individual entrances on 2 or more ground floors, the guidelines provide that each of these entrances shall be an accessible entrance on an accessible route unless an accessible entrance is impractical. Carriage house units. Carriage houses in which the garage footprint is used as the footprint for the remaining floor or floors of the units are not required to meet the design and construction requirements as per the 1991 memorandum from Frank Keating. If buildings containing carriage units have 1 or more units at grade level with an entrance on an accessible route, the grade level unit establishes a ground floor for the building and is covered. Buildings with ground floors over shops or garages. When dwelling units are located over retail stores, garages, and other common use spaces, the floor with dwelling units is considered the ground floor, making the dwelling units covered. The image on the screen shows a 3-story building. The first story, which is at grade level, is used entirely for parking, shops, or other common use spaces. The second floor is considered the ground floor, and the units on that floor are covered under the FHA. An accessible route to the dwelling unit entrances must be provided from the first story to the second story. The third floor single-story units are not covered under the FHA. Buildings with 1 or more common entrances. When a building has 1 or more common entrances, the guidelines provide that at least one of these entrances shall be accessible and on an accessible route to all dwelling units in buildings with 1 or more elevators and to all ground floor units in non-elevator buildings. Buildings with common entrances and a single ground floor. In this example, we have a non-elevator building with 1 ground floor. The entire structure is 3 stories. All ground floor units are covered and must be served by an accessible entrance on an accessible route. Here, we find an accessible route from the parking lot to the accessible entrance at the front of the building. There is also another entrance at the end of the building that's accessed by stairs. Not all ground floor entrances must be accessible, but more than one may be necessary. Buildings with common entrances and more than one ground floor. In building designs that are planned to have more than one ground floor, an entrance on each ground floor must be accessible unless site conditions make it impractical. In this example, the planned location of parking and sidewalk is close to the planned entrances, with only minor changes in level between the arrival points and the floor level of the building at the planned entrances. Therefore, it is practical to make the planned entrances accessible. Because the common entrances are accessible via an accessible route, all the dwelling units served by each entrance are covered dwelling units and must meet the guidelines requirements. This means that the middle and lower level units are covered. Buildings with common entrances and clustered dwelling units. Where dwelling units are clustered in a building, each cluster with its own entrance or entrances shall have at least one accessible entrance, providing access to all ground floor units in the cluster. This example shows a single building with no elevator and multiple common use entrances serving clustered dwelling units. Each cluster must have an accessible entrance on an accessible route, and you can see those areas shown in blue on your screen. Building floor having common entrances served by elevated walkways. When a developer plans an elevated walkway from a pedestrian or vehicular arrival point to the building entrance, and the walkway has a slope of 10% or less, that floor shall be considered a ground floor. The example on the screen has an accessible route to the second floor common entrance, which causes this floor to be considered a ground floor. The dwelling units on that floor are covered, and the site is not considered impractical. Since the walkway meets the 10% slope criterion, it is practical to provide an accessible route to the entrance, and the slope of the walkway must be reduced to 8.33% maximum. And that brings us to our 10th and final knowledge check. And that knowledge check reads, if dwelling units are located above retail shops, the floor with the blank is considered the ground floor. And the first answer option is retail shops. The second answer option is dwelling units. And the third option is rooftop lounge. And let me launch this poll so that you can submit your answers. And again, the 10th knowledge check reads, if dwelling units are located above retail shops, the floor with the blank is considered the ground floor. Your first option is retail shops. Your second option is dwelling units. And the third option is rooftop lounge. And we'll give a few more seconds for everyone to submit their answers. And now we're going to close that poll and review our key takeaways for topic 4. Features of an accessible building entrance door include a minimum width of 32 inches, low or no threshold, clear maneuvering space inside and outside of the door, low force to open the door, accessible door hardware, and a safe door closing speed. In buildings without elevators, only ground floor dwelling units are covered, and each dwelling unit must be on an accessible route. The ground floor may or may not be at grade level. When dwelling units are located over retail stores, garages, and other common use spaces, the floor with the dwelling units is considered the ground floor. When a building has one or more common entrances, at least one of those entrances shall be accessible and on an accessible route to all dwelling units in buildings with one or more elevators and to all ground units in non-elevator buildings. And with that, we're going to move into our live Q&A and find out what questions have been submitted today during our training. So, Mr. Contreras, we have a question from Eric, and the question is, can you speak about when more than one accessible route may be required to a dwelling unit, such as when or if a patio entrance is required on an accessible route if there is an accessible route provided to the primary entry?
Thank you for that, Crystal. The Fair Housing Act requires that covered buildings must have at least one accessible entrance on an accessible route. Where a building has ground floor units, each with its own exterior entrance, each of the ground floor units must have an accessible entrance on an accessible route. So if a designer chooses a design that has the amenities, say for example, in a central courtyard or patio that contains amenities such as parking, clubhouse, mailboxes, dumpsters, etc., that are only accessible from a secondary door, and all of the units have access via a primary entrance that leads from the exterior perimeter sidewalk, a designer may need to provide an accessible route from the interior courtyard amenities as well as the primary entrance. It would not be acceptable to only provide one accessible route that will force persons with disabilities to traverse through a longer, hidden, remote, or circuitous distance to access the amenities.
For that answer, Eric. And the next question comes from Tammy. At what depth does a closet with double leaf doors require one of the doors to be 32 inches clear?
The Fair Housing Act Requirement 3 is for usable doors. Doors in public use areas and the primary entry door of the covered dwelling unit must be accessible. Doors inside the covered dwelling unit and the secondary door that require user passage must provide the 32-inch nominal opening. The guidelines do not set a parameter to determine when a closet becomes a walk-in closet. When designing a closet, consider that the maximum reach range for a person in a wheelchair to approach is 25 inches. If the closet depth exceeds the maximum reach range for a person in a wheelchair, it is necessary to consider that the person will have to wheel into the closet to reach the shelves, and thus the door should provide a 32-inch nominal clear width.
Thank you again for that answer. The next question is from Mark, and he asks, is requirement 5 applicable to common areas of a housing provider or inside dwellings only?
Requirement 5 applies to electrical switches, outlets, and other environmental controls within the covered dwelling units. Electrical switches, outlets, and other environmental controls in public use and common use areas are controls and operable parts that must comply with requirement 2 and must be on an accessible route and mounted within accessible reach ranges.
Thank you for that answer. Mark has another question that's also related to requirement 5, and he asks about the placement of security fob readers.
So again, requirement 5 of the Fair Housing Act applies to the electrical switches, outlets, and environmental controls within the covered dwelling unit. The Fair Housing Act requirement 2 covers the public use and common use areas that must be accessible for persons with disabilities. While fob readers are not explicitly mentioned in the Fair Housing Act, doorbells, fob readers, and intercoms are features provided for the public and residents that have operable parts necessary to access the building and common areas. As such, they must be accessible, complying with the specific provisions of the safe harbor chosen. They must be located on an accessible route, have a 30-inch by 48-inch clear floor space, and be mounted within accessible reach ranges, no higher than 48 inches above the floor. I would refer you to the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, page 2.12, that discusses the spaces and elements that are required to be accessible based on the Fair Housing Act guidelines and ANSI A 117.1. Specifically, operable parts are mentioned in numeral 9.
Thank you for that answer, Eric. And I do see how that question can tie into accessible entry, because if you need a fob to enter, that could be the case. We have time for maybe one other question. And Stephen has asked the question, are townhouses covered by the Act?
So townhouses are only covered by the Fair Housing Act in elevator buildings with 4 or more units that are built after March 13, 1991. The guidelines require that the primary entry level of townhouses in elevator buildings be covered by the Act, and the bathroom or powder room on that entry level is required to comply with the guidelines.
For that answer, and we have one other question that just popped up. This question is from Adam, and the question is, if I have a sidewalk that is 6 feet wide and it is steeper than 5%, and I add handrails at the edge of the sidewalk, will that be sufficient, or will I need to add a middle handrail?
If the sidewalk is part of an accessible route that connects covered dwelling units with site amenities, it is required to comply with the ANSI A117.1 or chosen safe harbor requirements. ANSI A117.1 and other safe harbors generally do not have requirements for installing an intermediate handrail, but please check your safe harbor for any specific provision. If the sidewalk is not part of an accessible route to amenities, but only a sidewalk between covered buildings, the sidewalk is not required to comply with the Fair Housing Act and the specific provisions of the safe harbor. Designers are encouraged, where site grades do not exceed 8.3%, to make accessible routes compliant, except that handrail provisions are not required. And you can refer to this in the frequently asked questions number 8 that discusses the accessible routes between buildings that only contain covered dwelling units.
Thank you again, Eric, for answering those questions. I want to thank the attendees for submitting those questions. And now we're going to review the knowledge checks. Knowledge check 1. A safe harbor is a standard guideline or code that ensures compliance with the FHA if followed without deviation. And again, the correct answer for knowledge check 1 is safe harbor. Knowledge check 2. The 7 requirements apply to covered multifamily dwellings occupied for the first time after March 13th, 1991, and that answer is true. Knowledge check 3. Buildings with 1 or more elevators can claim site impracticality? Never. Buildings with 1 or more elevators can never claim site impracticality. Knowledge check 4. The individual building test analyzes grade differences of an undisturbed site and planned building entrances and pedestrian arrival points. Again, that answer is the individual building test. Knowledge check 5. The site analysis test evaluates the topography of a site and determines the buildable area and the number of accessible units required. Again, that is the site analysis test is the correct answer for knowledge check 5. Knowledge check 6. An accessible route must have a minimum width of 36 inches. 36 inches. 36 is the correct answer. Knowledge check 7. When designing and constructing walkways, a slope steeper than 8.33% cannot be part of an accessible route. And the correct answer, again, is cannot be part of an accessible route. Knowledge check 9. An accessible entrance door must have a minimum width of 32 inches. Again, an accessible entrance door must have a minimum width of 32 inches, 32 being the correct answer. And lastly, knowledge check 10. If dwelling units are located above retail shops, the floor with the dwelling units is considered the ground floor. And again, dwelling units is the correct answer for knowledge check 10. And now we'll talk about your certificates for attending at least 45 minutes of today's presentation, you will receive an attendance certificate. If you attended for less than 45 minutes, you will not receive an attendance certificate. The attendance certificate will be sent to you on Wednesday. If you do not receive the attendance certificate by Thursday morning, please check your junk or spam email. And if it's not there, email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov and we'll make sure that you received it. If you take the final quiz and pass the quiz, you will receive a passing certificate. The final quiz will be in the email that comes to participants 2 hours after the end of the webinar. Quizzes may be taken at any time following this training event, and certificates of passing are automatically issued when a passing score of 80% or better is achieved. If you do not receive your passing quiz certificate by Friday evening, please check your junk or spam email. And if it's not there, you can email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov and we will make sure that you get that passing certificate. Training evaluation. At the end of this training, there is a training event survey for you to complete. We appreciate your responses and support in improving our training products. Contacts. Please contact us with further questions via the DCRC by calling 888-341-7781. And that phone number is accessible by voice or teletypewriter. Or feel free to email us at fairhousingfirst@hud.gov. You can also scan the QR code you see on your screen, and that will add the DCRC's contact info to your telephone's address book. We would like to thank our presenters, our technical staff, our ASL interpreters, and of course, you, the attendees. This screen will remain up for 20 seconds after the broadcast to allow you to scan the QR code or screenshot the contact information on the screen. Again, we thank you for attending this training session, and we hope you have a fantastic day.